It is now Donald Trump versus the honest people. That's according to esteemed Washington journalist Elizabeth Drew. Over the next 3 days, 9 more impeachment witnesses will testify publicly in the impeachment inquiry of Donald Trump. Many of them will be career civil servants who are testifying out of a sense of duty to the Constitution and the rule of law. These are the honest people Donald Trump cannot fathom. That is according to Elizabeth Drew, who writes in a New York Times op-ed that these career diplomats, quote, will endure only so much abuse or see only so much scandal around them before rising up in some way. Mr. Trump made a big mistake by demeaning civil servants from the outset and then setting about trying to make them irrelevant. But Elizabeth Drew also argues that it would be a mistake for Democrats to focus articles of impeachment against Donald Trump narrowly on only his misconduct toward Ukraine, writing, quote, the great danger is that the legacy of this period will be that Mr. Trump got caught doing one bad thing rather than that he abused power across the board and wantonly violated the Constitution. I'm pleased to say we are joined now by Elizabeth Drew, a political journalist who covered the impeachments of both Richard Nixon and Bill Clinton. She is the author of Washington Journal, Reporting Watergate and Richard Nixon's Downfall. Liz Drew, it's such an honor to have you here. I began reading you on impeachment when I was in college on the Nixon impeachment, and here we are again. To your point about the narrowness of the possible articles of impeachment, we do have this development tonight that we were just discussing, that a lawyer in court today representing the House of Representatives said that they are considering a possible article of impeachment involving this possible perjury in the written answer that President Trump gave Robert Mueller about never discussing WikiLeaks with anyone. And we just had that testimony in the Roger Stone case of, yes, he discussed WikiLeaks with Roger Stone. So that could be an expanded set of impeachment articles if that's added.
Well, yes, and so could obstruction of his trying to keep anybody from testifying and blocking documents from being produced. But it's still all around just the one subject, Lawrence, the one subject of Ukraine. And there are so many other things that he did. The abuse of power across the board, wanton neglect of constitutional duties or restrictions. So it's still one subject. And the problem is we're dealing with the day-to-day history, day-to-day events of now and the politics of now. But this is going to be history. This is going to be precedent. And so what's going to go down is he did this one bad thing, and those other things that you suggest, which might be separate articles or not, are still only on that one subject. I think it's too narrow.
There's also this thing that we've seen in both of the impeachment votes that we've seen. The Nixon votes in the committee, Judiciary Committee, which was as far as it got before he resigned, and then the Clinton votes in the Senate, for example. And that is that there were some people, some Republicans especially, who voted for some articles of impeachment against Richard Nixon, or voted for one, but they didn't vote for all 3. I think there was only one Republican who voted for all 3. And with Bill Clinton, there were people who voted in favor of one article and against another article. And so that's always left the impression that just strategically, you might want to lay out a menu of options so that, for example, a Republican could say, well, I voted against 2 articles of impeachment against the president, but this one I just couldn't take.
That could be. I'm not sure that would work now. We had a different Republican Party, especially during the Nixon period. Do you remember Republican moderates, Lawrence? Or you were old enough to know about moderate Republicans. And in that Judiciary Committee, it was a strategy from the outset that it had to be bipartisan or the country would never accept it. That's a big difference from now. But there were moderate Republicans who were ready to vote independently of the president. Now you have such loyalty and such fear of both the president and his tweets and of his base that I'm not sure that people would. That isn't my reason for wanting it to be, for thinking it should be broader. I think that there's a sort of dumbing down of the public and thinking, well, this is the only thing they can understand. I don't think that's true. I think that, for example, I wouldn't do it, I wouldn't have 10 articles, maybe 3 or 4. But they could understand a president and his family kind of looting the federal government to their own enrichment, him in particular. That's easy to understand, and there are lots of examples of it. So I just think it should be, there should be a broader picture of the abuse of power that characterizes this presidency.
Liz, I want to get a final word from you tonight about these people who you wrote about in the New York Times, these people who Donald Trump thinks of negatively as bureaucrats, basically, and he thinks of them as rising up against him, when in fact they're simply coming forward to testify under oath and tell the truth as they know it.
Well, they didn't have to come and testify. That's really the point. In fact, they were told not to. So they've shown a lot of courage. And these are people that the general public has never heard of, never would have heard of. And Donald Trump can't begin to fathom these people because, among other things, they don't care how much money they make. They could go in the private sector and do much better, but they want to serve the government. And that sets them apart. He can't understand them.
If you're not reading Elizabeth Drew about impeachment, you're not understanding it as well as you can. Elizabeth Drew gets tonight's last word. An honor to have you with us tonight, Liz. Thank you very much for joining us. Thanks for checking out our YouTube channel. Subscribe by clicking on the button below for more from The Last Word and the rest of MSNBC.